Right. So I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to get started. I see participants coming in. Welcome, welcome. Some people will be here and some people will be in the Whova platform. So I'm going to keep an eye on both, but I'll give everybody just a few moments to get in, get their audio set up, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, welcome everyone. This session is being recorded and will be available on demand to watch later. But welcome to our virtual week keynote session. Contains Scenes of Mild Peril, the state of digital preservation across 7 million articles. I'm happy to have Martin Paul Eve join us for this session. Thank you so much for being here. A quick biography and background. Martin Paul Eve is the principal R&D developer at Crossref and the professor of literature, technology, and publishing at the University of London's Birkbeck College. He's well known for his work in open access policy circles, having founded the Open Library of Humanities, as well as authoring 9 books, all openly accessible, including Open Access and the Humanities, Context, Controversies, and the Future. In 2018, Martin was awarded the KU Leuven Medal of Honor in the Humanities and Social Sciences. In 2019, he received the Philip Leverhulme Prize for Literary Studies, and in 2021, Martin was named by the Shaw Trust as one of the 100 most influential disabled people in the UK. So thank you so much, Martin, for joining us. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. We'll answer questions after his presentation. Take it away, Martin.
Thank you very much, and a huge thanks to Leah and everybody for organising this. Just to say, it makes an enormous difference to people with conditions like mine who are immunocompromised to still have these virtual platforms to speak and to meet with the community. So I'm really grateful that you've made the effort to continue that. Thank you. Okay, I want to talk about a not very trendy topic today. 2 not very trendy topics, in fact, one of which is digital preservation, which sounds like a very mundane, trivial matter that we've now got under control and everything's fine. Why would we want to talk about that? I'm going to tell you about an experiment that I conducted today that has revealed some alarming deficits in the digital preservation infrastructure that we have, and in the journal ecosystem in particular. I also want to talk today, though, about investment in infrastructure and thinking about the technological systems that underpin everything that we do in digital publishing circles, and that we take for granted, but when they fail, fall away. And the fact that essentially we have an austerity culture around many of these infrastructures and rely on volunteerist backdrops for systems that are really very crucial to our publishing enterprises. So let's start with what we don't know about digital preservation. I work at Crossref, which is the linking organization and DOI registrar that provides the DOI links that you see on every published scholarly article. Why does Crossref care about digital preservation? Well, the idea of a DOI, the digital object identifier, is that it's a link that points to content that can be repointed to different content. Say if a publisher goes bankrupt, or if the content changes and moves, if a publisher is taken over and it moves to a different platform, we can repoint the DOI. So essentially, when you cite using a DOI, the idea is that that URL is persistent. However, the persistence of that persistent link depends upon a digital preservation structure. If a publisher goes bankrupt and they've got no way of backing up what they did, and that content no longer exists anywhere online, there's nowhere to point the DOI. And that's why, as a condition of being a Crossref member, you agree to take best steps towards digital preservation in a trusted third-party dark archive. So that's one of the conditions of being a Crossref member. Do we actually check whether Crossref members are preserving their material and where they're doing it? Well, we have a metadata field that lets them submit to us, when they give us their metadata, the archives in which material would be preserved. But do we know that assertion made by the publisher is accurate? Most publishers do not give us that assertion when they deposit. So most publishers are not telling us that they are depositing, and we're just having to assume that they are complying with the terms and conditions of being a Crossref member. How stable are the preservation systems that underpin this preservation system and this persistent identifier infrastructure? We don't know that people are preserving in recognized archives that we trust and that are adhering to best practices for digital preservation. Which actors are behaving well on this theme? Is it the case that actually there's a set of really small bespoke publishers who do digital preservation really well and the mega publishers are shirking their duties? We don't know this at the moment. Perhaps most worryingly, we're not quite sure who should be doing this in a digital age. When we were in a print infrastructure, it was really obvious. Libraries ordered material that went on the shelves. Preserving the material was part of providing access to the material. There was no point having a half-destroyed book on the shelf that couldn't be accessed because it was in such poor state. And so preservation was a physical part of the library's role. When we moved into the digital world of licensing, open access, web available content, there was a shift in the burden of preservation to the publisher side. Suddenly that's where the bona fide copy was that needed to be preserved. And we decided to shift that balance. Yet it's also the case that systems like Clocks, Locks, and Portico that I'm going to talk about later are still based in academic libraries. So you've got this case where we've shifted from material being preserved by libraries to material being preserved by publishers, but doing so through the technological infrastructure of contemporary academic libraries. So the actual answer to who should be doing this is a bit of both, but the lack of clarity on that leads to a confusing situation where nobody's quite sure what they're supposed to be doing. The Crossref terms and conditions of membership that say that members should be preserving their material implies that publishers should be doing this, although we know, of course, also that many libraries are also publishers. The perhaps most apocalyptic of our questions that we don't know the answer to, really, though, is it already too late? There's a vast quantity of material published, and every year it's growing exponentially larger. Is it too late for us to resurrect material that wasn't digitally preserved? Is there anything we can do about material that's been published that wasn't preserved at the time of its publication? What can we do to save material from digital oblivion? With the average lifespan of a corporation in this world being around 20 years, what do we think the average lifespan of a digital object is? And what are we doing in the scholarly space where citation depends upon that chain existing to preserve this material? Fortunately, although I said we don't know about this, it's not that we don't know nothing about this. We have got some existing material that helps us to appraise the state of digital preservation. Mikhail Laxo, for instance, and his crew wrote an article, Open is Not Forever, a study of vanished open access journals, a recent piece that looks at the cases of open access journals that have gone offline and finding out whether their material is still accessible. And it turns out that quite a bit of their material is accessible in the Internet Archive, a system sometimes frowned upon by professional digital preservation librarians, but a system nonetheless that is providing clearly a valuable service in the case where these entities have disappeared entirely. There's also, perhaps more importantly, a really central system called the Keepers Registry that's operated for many years. This was originally a project at the University of Edinburgh and Edina, and the idea was to amalgamate the catalogues of digital preservation dark archives, to pull them together into a central location so that you could look at the container level as to whether something had been preserved. So the Keepers Registry will tell you that for a specific ISSN, this volume and this issue have been preserved in these archives. And it's got quite a fairly broad range of archives that I'll come on to shortly. After the transition period, when this was originally funded by JISC in the UK, the Joint Infrastructural Services Council, the Keepers Registry was transferred to the ISSN in Foundation. And that's great because it's enabled the Keepers Registry to continue operating beyond the lifespan of its pilot. What's quite difficult and troubling, though, is that the Keepers Registry offers no API for easy lookup, so we can't programmatically look up whether material is being preserved. And the licensing conditions for using the Keepers Registry state that it can't be used in any form other than individual lookups. So a mechanized automatic lookup system against the Keepers Registry to find out at scale what the digital preservation landscape looks like is simply not allowed according to the official terms and conditions. And this leads us to what I'd say is an infrastructural deficit. We have no item level data about digital preservation worldwide in a central location where we can look up, given say a DOI, is this material preserved? And if so, where? And to be frank, this should be of concern to anybody who's using the material. When you cite something and give a location of where you can find it, the idea is that those in the future can verify your epistemic claims about that link between your work and the work that's being cited. As more and more work becomes born digital and has only a digital existence, if this work is not preserved, we don't know for how long that epistemic chain is going to hold. And at what point, when it breaks, you'll have to fall back to just having blind trust in a system of publishing that doesn't give you access to the material itself. So because I'm somewhat of a masochist, I decided that it would be a good idea to do a project this year to build an item level preservation database so that we could look up at scale across a large number of Crossref DOIs what the preservation landscape looks like and work out just how much material is actually preserved. Now, we didn't cover everything that's in the Keepers Registry. This was only a prototype project, but nonetheless, we covered a fair portion of the dark archives that are covered in the Keepers Registry. So, for instance, Cariniana, which specializes in preservation of Southern American material. The Clocks Archive, the controlled lots of copies keep stuff safe system based at Stanford and around libraries, particularly in the US. We looked at the Hathi Trust archive, which has digitized the collections of many major, particularly US libraries. We looked at the Internet Archive and their catalogue, FatCat, which in fact is the only item level preservation catalogue that we could find to date. That really doesn't work at the issue and volume and ISSN level. It works at the this article, this page, this DOI level. Locks, which is the open version of Clocks, lots of copies keep stuff safe. PKP, the Public Knowledge Project, who run open journal systems, have a private locks network designed specifically for open journal systems users to be able to preserve their work. Portico, a very long-standing project of Ithaca, a digital preservation archive, and the Scholars Portal at OCL, which was a private data source, and I couldn't unfortunately get a holdings file to publicly list for that, but they are very accommodating if you write to them and ask to get access. So that's how we had access to that archive. So these were the systems against which we decided to test our lookup system and to build a system where you can put in a DOI and ascertain if it exists in any of these archives. You'll note perhaps the biggest omission here is that I do not include green open access repositories or institutional repositories in this. And several publishers have come back to me after the fact and said, well, you know what, we actually do a lot of work working with repositories. And some digital preservation librarians say that's a really good thing. You know, it's another copy that's keeping stuff safe. Other digital preservation librarians point out that these do not have the same robust level of preservation practices as, say, Clocks, Locks, and Portico. So some dispute around green open access, but you should take all the statements I make about preservation today with a hint of salt, pinch of salt, knowing that these are the archives I'm talking about. If it's outside these archives, it could still be preserved in other locations, but we would not detect it. In order to do some kind of appraisal of the preservation landscape, we also need a grading system. And it turns out in my searching of the digital preservation literature that I can't find an actual best set of practices for what you're supposed to do to have a really good digital preservation system. So I'm afraid I made up the Martin Eve grading system for digital preservation, which runs from gold through to unclassified and tries to score across two axes. I wanted to score across the axis of the percentage of content that a publisher was preserving and the number of archives in which they were doing it. So a gold member, in my terminology, is one that has 75% of their content digitally preserved in 3 or more recognized archives. So 75% of your published material is found in Clocks, Locks, and Portico, for instance. That would be an instance of a gold member. A silver member, by my calculations, are those that have 50% of content in 2 or more archives. A bronze member, 25% in 1 or more recognized archive. That doesn't seem a terribly high barrier to hit. And then unclassified are those that don't even make the bronze level. They have less than 25% in 1 archive or more. So Crossref has around 145 million digital object identifiers, metadata records. I think it's up to 150 now, actually, since I first wrote this talk. So it's growing every day. It's a lot of records. Sampling against that and doing it against the entire 150 million records takes a very long time. You end up just running your computer for weeks on end, going away and coming back and finding it's still going. So we have what we call the sampling framework, which pulls out a random sample across all Crossref members so that we can get an idea of what the landscape looks like without having to sample every single DOI that exists in the system. So thanks to my colleague Dominika, I pulled out 7 million or so, 7.4 million DOIs in the sample, and was able to run our system against those 7.4 million DOIs rather than 150. That seems to give a pretty good idea of what the ecosystem looks like without having to scan the entire system. The Labs API presents preservation findings. So this is the prototype API that we run at Crossref at api.labs.crossref.org. And if you look up one of the DOIs that I tested against, there's now preservation information listed there. All the data is public in AWS S3 as well, and this presentation will be made available for recordings afterwards for those who want to go and look into the data and find out what's going on. Okay, so the big unveil. What does it actually look like? Pretty dire is the actual answer. Gold membership, which you'd hope would be the gold standard, as its name implies. It turns out that fewer than 2% of Crossref members actually make the gold standard of having 75% in 3 or more archives. Silver does a bit better. We have 8.46% of Crossref members who make that 50% in 2 archives. So that's 1,797 or so Crossref members who are preserving in 2 archives. So even if one of those archives fails, they do still have at least a backup system that would be able to preserve their material. Bronze is by far the largest category at 57.7% of Crossref members, so almost 2/3. Well, a little way off 2/3, but close to 2/3. Oh, well over half anyway have only 25% in 1 archive. So that's quite a disappointing statistic in many ways. It seems to show that people are not doing a very good job. I'd like to put a more positive spin on it, which is 58% or so of Crossref members know that they're supposed to be doing digital preservation. They may not be doing it to a degree that gives a very high level of background redundancy, but they know that they're supposed to preserve and they have got some material in at least 1 archive. And then we have unclassified, where we have no archival status that we can detect, with approximately a third, 32.9% of all Crossref members falling in that bracket. And that's 6,982 members. So overall, if you take bronze and unclassified as a group and silver and gold as a group, we've got far more members in the worrying category where the material seems more at risk of bronze and unclassified than we have in silver and gold. And there's quite a long way to go before we get anywhere close to those categories being equal to each other. I should say the one thing about my grading scale is that because it measures two different axes and 75% in three or 50% in two, 25% in one, it becomes exponentially harder to achieve the highest goal because you have to get your percentage of material up as well as getting the number of archives up. So I did just want to point out that there is a kind of exponential trail off here of difficulty in achieving those higher bands, but it doesn't by itself account for the exponential increase in members as we get down towards bronze. So one of my other questions was, which type of actor is doing this well? Who's behaving well in this space? Who's doing it not so well? And there are several ways that we can judge the size of members at Crossref. We can look at member revenue, which is the first banding system that I'm going to introduce here. We can look at the amount of money basically that organizations pull in and grade them as an organization size as a result. Alternatively, we can look at the volume of material that they publish, which is not the same thing. It's possible to have small members who publish a high volume of material and very wealthy members who publish a low volume of material. So size of member is a contested term, but it's one that I'm going to have a look at here and try to sort out a little bit. So in this graph, we move from the smallest members, so the least wealthy members at the very top, and the very wealthiest members at the bottom. And I think there are some interesting trends that emerge from this graphical plotting as we move from least wealthy to wealthiest. The first is that there are a small number of very small publishers who do a very good job at digital preservation. There are some of them who really care. They're that little gold band at the end and the silver band on the right-hand side at the top right of this diagram. But there are also a large number of them in the bronze category and a large number in the unclassified category. And that remains the same until about halfway down that pattern, that the gold and silver are the minority, while bronze and unclassified take up the majority. It's only when we get to those with more resources that we start to see silver in particular coming to dominate, and except in one case where bronze, third largest wealth category, still manages to dominate. Actually, we see a preponderance of silver taking its place, and in the wealthiest category, a few gold. Although there are so few members in this very wealthiest category, I think it's over $100 million revenue per year, that one member changing category can have a significant effect on the graph plot. When we look at preservation by member deposits, we see a similar phenomenon at work. In fact, those that publish the least material seem to have the worst preservation practices of all, with an enormous amount of that unclassified. Although because they're not publishing very much, it's possible that we don't know, there isn't very much in that actual top category there. It could be that not very much is not very well preserved, is what this graph actually shows. What it does show is that the silver category again comes to dominate as we get down towards the bigger members. The more you publish, the more likely you are to meet the silver and to some extent the gold categories, although that's again skewed by just a few members falling into that category. And so it kind of pains me to say it, but one of the things that really emerges from this graphing is that those publisher members who have more resources do a better job at securing their publications for the future. Elsevier does a really good job at digital preservation. It's in the gold category, the biggest publisher on the planet. Its material is in 3 or more registered dark archives. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. On the other hand, some of the more boutique publishers that we might want to support because we value that diversity, we value the niche areas of epistemology they bring to the academy, for instance, are often poorly preserved because they just don't have the resources to participate. We need to do something about this, is my feeling. We also looked at this at the works level. So those previous graphs were looking at members and what happens across the member base, but you can look at it at the number of works that we sampled. We did find that 58% were preserved at least once. So 60% or so of things that you might cite anywhere do seem to have at least one preservation instance, which is promising. However, that left 27.6% or so that seemed entirely unpreserved. So there's a 1 in 4 chance, if you're just citing something at random from any source that's in Crossref, that you might hit an unpreserved item that will not continue to exist if the publisher went out of business. I just to point out that we excluded about 14% of works because they were either too recent, so they weren't yet ingested into a digital preservation archive, they weren't journal articles, or there was insufficient metadata for us to identify the source and work out how they translated into that item level database that we had before. And I should say, part of that infrastructural deficit I mentioned earlier is that it's really difficult to translate directly from a DOI into a keeper's registry formatted style. This issue, this volume, and this ISSN are preserved in this archive. You have to translate from the DOI, get its metadata, dereference the metadata, find the issue, volume, ISSN, then look them up against the dark archives that we found in the first place. There's a lot of scope for things to go wrong in that process. Say someone submitted the wrong metadata and given us the issue and the volume the wrong way around. A simple thing like that will skew that result entirely and could give us completely false readbacks on whether something is digitally preserved. So we're reliant on good metadata in order for this to work. And we don't always have good metadata. So these results are as good as we can get, but they're still a little fuzzy thanks to that lookup system. So what can we do next about this preservation situation? What can we possibly do to enhance the landscape and make this a better place for the preservation of material? Well, the first thing is we've got a forthcoming peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Librarianship and Scholarly Communication that's got the full data set attached as well. So people can look up what we're saying, check it, help us to refine it and build better systems for checking digital preservation. We've got a lay and easy read summary coming up. So we appreciate that not everybody is a digital preservation librarian. We think that more people should be interested in digital preservation, particularly scholars themselves. So we've got some material in blog form that can be passed on that talks about this experiment, that talks about the particularly dire state of digital preservation as we've perceived it from this experiment, and lets them know what they should be doing so that the next scholar who goes to set up their own scholar-led journal knows that they're supposed to be doing digital preservation and can work out how they can do it. We want to do some direct member outreach as well once those resources are out there. We've now got the ability to find members who seem to be struggling with this, and it would be great to reach out to some of them in a non-confrontational way to say, hey, it looks like you need some help with digital preservation, otherwise your material is going to disappear. What can we do to get involved in that? And one of those projects that we've launched to try to get this off the ground is called Project OpSit, which is basically the understanding that because most scholarly material that's published flows through Crossref's DOI system at a point of metadata deposit, we've actually got the ideal point to enact a digital preservation mechanism. What if, when you deposited with Crossref, we automatically sent the material to digital preservation archives so that they can be preserved? We've had a lot of interest in that from preservation archives, from the Internet Archive as well, and we're building a prototype for that right now, which we'll open to a select few members to try out in the new year once that's off the ground. And last but not least, we've got the full charts and data set at thevault.fly.dev, the -vault.fly.dev, which should give you the opportunity to look up various publishers, publishing libraries, Crossref members, to determine what their preservation status looks like and to view the data that we used against them to come to that conclusion. Again, the data is not comprehensive. It's looking at those archives that I specified earlier, but it's still a pretty good snapshot among those archives. Okay, that's all great, but what was missing? What would have made this project a lot easier? Why was it that in the first place I had to go back and build an item level digital preservation database? Why doesn't that exist somewhere already? I mean, it seems to me absolutely crucial that if we think that libraries and publishers share the task of preserving material, then we need some kind of central registry of what has actually been preserved, and ideally one that works at the item level, because that's how we work now. We don't work with a whole volume of a journal. We go to specific articles within that directly via web links. The journal volume has just become an archaic binding mechanism, really, that brings together material, sometimes with a thematic coherence, but often not, under a single banner of a journal name. But really, the volume and issue are legacies of the print world, where we had to split them up for physical production purposes. But it means that we don't have the digital infrastructure for that now that we've transitioned to an article level system. So we're missing a huge data infrastructure here, and I had to spend quite a lot of time rebuilding it. It seems to me also that we're missing quite a lot of technical capacity at smaller publishers or Crossref members. The graphs we saw show quite clearly that the smaller members were not doing quite such a good job at digital preservation. And that's either a matter of resourcing or a matter of technical understanding and capacity. I mean, how many members actually read in detail the Crossref terms and conditions of membership, or how many just scrolled through and clicked I accept, as so many of us do in the digital age when we're confronted with terms and conditions? Or was it a matter of time and labor that was missing at those publishers? The fact that it's the least resourced publishers that seem to have the problem, and that digital preservation systems cost in order to run and in order to be a part of. It could well be that they simply didn't have the manpower, the human power on board to do the work of digital preservation, which remains labor intensive and reliant on a lot of librarian work behind the scenes, but also publisher work to get the material in the first place, to set up the relationships, to ensure the copyright agreements are in place, and so forth. And I think this resourcing issue matters in our contemporary digital age and around issues of open access. And I just want to talk now for the final sort of 10-15 minutes of this talk about the various axes of the open access movement and how finance and resourcing fits into those, and what we can expect to see from new open access publishers who pop up, who haven't come from a legacy print background and who are not one of those mega publishers. So it strikes me that the open access movement was premised around two different arguments that moved in two different directions, even if they look like they have the same goal and outcome. The first of those was a financial axis. We know that libraries have suffered under the serials crisis for the past many years, at least 30 years, with exponential increases in hyperinflationary price increases in the costs of subscribing to all serials, to the extent where even big Ivy League institutions have stopped subscribing on the basis of price. We also know that the other side of this was about access, and that there are some open access advocates, particularly at funders, who have been saying, well, actually, you know what, we're willing to pay. We don't mind if it costs the same or even perhaps more than it cost in the print age. What we care about is eradicating the access gap. That's the important thing, is whether people can read the material, not how much it costs to get that material published. And these two things look the same. They look like they're both about getting over these barriers to access. One, you know, if your library can't afford to pay for it, then open access becomes the answer. The other, well, we'll pay in order that libraries can have access to it. But they pull in different directions. One of them pulls towards an austerity in publishing, saying if it's about reducing the cost, we need to do this as cheaply as possible. We need to do this with as little labor as possible. We need to cut all financial investment where we can so that this can be done at the lowest price possible for libraries. The other side is not interested in that cost-cutting exercise necessarily. It's more interested in moving towards a system where everybody has access, even at a cost. Now, you don't have to just be one or the other of these. This is not a binary polarity. It's a spectrum, much like those political quadrants you see where we divide people up into left libertarian or right authoritarian and whatever. There are various political orientations of this open access movement. So certainly here in the UK, there's, for instance, a right financial movement who think that publishing is too expensive and it's taxpayer money that's going into it. And so therefore we should cut this expenditure because it's not right for publishers to be enriching the private coffers of multinational corporations who make a lot of money out of academic publishing. Then there's a right-wing access movement that again can be founded on a taxpayer argument that seems to say, well, taxpayers invested in this, so taxpayers should have access to this. And it's important that they get access to this because they're the ones who have funded it. And although we're not calling for the cost decreases necessarily in this access, we still recognize that this should give the taxpayer public the right to access to it. The slight problem with that argument is that there's so much research material that isn't taxpayer funded that it would be good if everybody had access to that anyway. And so that's where the taxpayer argument tends to fall down, is that it excludes so much material that doesn't fall under that, that rubric of the taxpayer funded this, while it would still have educational value and have great improvement to society as a result. There's then a left financial axis that is disgusted with corporate profiteering and wants to see that reduced. So there's an argument for cutting the investment in publishing circles from that direction. And there's a left access movement, probably where I find myself most strongly affiliated, that feels itself in a situation that wants to benefit humankind from access to educational material, as I was just saying, and so works from that perspective. Not necessarily thinking about the finance in this quadrant, but thinking about how access itself is a merit. And you can be somewhere between these. There are people on the left who feel disgusted at the corporate profiteering and believe in access for social good reasons, and so will be somewhere in a square on this, and on the other side as well. But basically, the motivations for open access are actually quite tricky. They're not a straightforward binary as people think, that everybody's pulling in the same direction. People may want the same outcome, open access, but they want to do so through very different means that result in very different structures of publication and very different funding structures of publication, which has implications for digital preservation, as I was saying before. So I've got a set of kind of theses that I'm going to close up on here, and one of the ways that the finance-oriented group find themselves thinking, and it's a line that I've thought along myself, is that they want to move a lot of academic publishing to voluntary systems run often by faculty and libraries on a system of volunteerism rather than a system that operates on a sustainability or business model. Now, I venture that trying to move all academic publishing, this is a bit of a straw argument. I know they're not saying all necessarily, but let's go to the extreme with this. Trying to move all academic publishing to a voluntary system free of all finance is a really bad idea. We end up with under-resourced publishers, overworked academics who end up doing tasks that they don't enjoy and didn't want to be doing in the first place and feel bitter about, that are poorly, it seems, digitally preserved, as we can hazard from our least well-resourced members in that system. Now, one of the counter arguments is, well, if we didn't finance the very, very big publishers, we can afford to finance the smaller publishers. But would we do it well enough to ensure that they could do their digital preservation structures with competence? Are we confident that there's the expertise and knowledge and professionalism there to make that work? Clearly, there are digital preservation specialists at Elsevier who really know what they're doing. Would we get that same level of volunteerist investment if we went to a system that had far less investment within it, and far less wealthy publishers throughout the system? So while this whole talk is not an argument for the mega profiteering of big publishers, which still remains quite extreme by the mechanisms of many sectors, what I am saying is that systems that are completely free of finance and completely under-resourced tend to do a very bad job at digital preservation. I also want to point out that no technological system runs itself. One of the most common arguments is, well, we can just set up a system that will forever perpetuate itself. We can make it automatic. We can eliminate all human labor from this, and then it will be an infallible system and much stronger than the systems we have at the moment. I'm afraid that's never the case, and digital preservation to this day still involves a lot of librarian labor. Whenever a new file format comes out that needs preserving, for instance, whenever new media formats come out, say a new video encoding format, we have to work out separately how to store that, how to make it accessible in a decade's time, in 50 years' time, even in 100 years' time. Trying to open, say, a Lotus file from 2 decades ago, but is incredibly problematic on a modern PC. And why is that? Because nobody took the effort to continue to make it accessible. Without that continued labor and investment and thinking from digital preservation librarians, we lose access over decadal to century-long time spans. So no technological system runs itself, and these things require infrastructural investment. Every so often also a little angel comes along on the horizon, some kind of savior that we think might rescue us from the digital preservation disaster. Blockchain was perhaps the most recent. Why don't we have a completely centralized system, decentralized system, where anybody can put material onto it and it will just exist? It will not just exist. It will crumble to dust without continued investment, continued operational support from the people who run such systems. So just saying no when these seemingly too good to be true saviors come along is another one of my theses. We have to think in longer terms about the human labor that can support digital preservation and support our continued access to scholarship. Persistence, preservation, and infrastructure require persistent, preserved, that is ongoing, investment. There are very few publishers in the digital space now, especially now that the Mellon Foundation has changed its focus, all for the good, to orient itself towards social justice projects. There are very few funders out there who are looking at the infrastructural side of things and thinking what can be done. Now, Arcadia Foundation is one of them, for example, who've done a great job in recent years, but we need more funders to invest in the basic infrastructure of publication and access if we're not to see a cataclysm. Delegating this to the third-party market has clearly not done a good enough job of securing our material for centuries to come. The great libraries of our great academic institutions have managed to secure various volumes for hundreds of years now. We cannot say the same about our digital preservation systems, and I feel that we're heading towards disaster with the current setup that we have. And finally, this is a thesis learnt predominantly through personal experience, which is that scholar-led or not-for-profit open access initiatives can do infrastructure well, but not as an academic side hobby. They need sustainability models, they need initial funding, and they need ways of continuing to exist beyond their funding period with revenue coming in to give academics the time and scholars the time to work with librarian colleagues to pay for that labor that I was talking about in the digital preservation space. Just doing this on the side as something that you think doesn't require investment is a huge cataclysmic mistake. just as that move to total volunteerism that I mentioned earlier would have been too. So that's where I'm going to stop, and then we've got some time for some questions. Thank you so much again for having me. I hope that was of interest and everyone isn't too scared, but as I say, the digital preservation landscape contains scenes of mild peril. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was wonderful. We do have time for questions for Q&A, and we have a couple of them already in the queue. Some of them were submitted early on, and I think you've answered some of the content that's there, but I'm going to read out the questions just so that they can be covered completely. So Janelle asked, in your study or from experience, do Crossref members preserve all of their content, or are they selective?
It's a good question. Many of them preserve all their content because their platform provides the ability to do so. Some of the smaller members using OJS seem to have founded their journals and began publishing without assigning DOIs or without any preservation in place. Then at some point in their life cycle, they've wanted to step up on the professionalism and preservation, and they've got into DOIs, they've got their object identifiers, and then they start to say, oh, we need to do preservation as well, and they've gone from that point onwards. Now, OJS does have the ability to go back in time and get the material that was previously there ingested. So, if you go to clocks, you can tell them to ingest from the very beginning. But it seems that not everyone's done that, and not everyone's assigned DOIs to all of the content that they've ever published. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I'd say, from what we saw, many are doing all of their content, but it's by far from everyone.
Thank you. We have two from Bill Kasdorf. He asked, is this presentation focused on journal articles or all deposits, including books, chapters, and proceedings? And then said, I believe he just answered this. So a complementary question is, what about preservation of those other formats? Is that also dire? I suppose so.
Okay, so I'm getting into quite a speculative realm here. I did journal articles because it was the low-hanging fruit. There was already some kind of infrastructure in place to look this up with ease. It was hard work creating the item level database, but it wasn't impossible. It's possible to go to clocks and to find their manifest of what they ingest in journal article terms, and to get that into another system so that we can look things up. Books, there's just simply no centralized infrastructure to tell us about that, or artifacts beyond books. Heaven help you. It's a wild west of things we don't know. My guess is it's not good at all. Books have been much slower, scholarly books, to transition to a digital state. It's likely that they will maintain their print status forever after, not just because authors like it, but because print remains the best random and sequential access mechanism for looking up scholarship. Nothing actually beats flicking to a page, especially on your Kindle, where you're frustratingly trying to search through. It's not the same. So the media form does still matter in that long form scholarship. But it means that the digital infrastructure has received commensurately less attention. So I don't know. I convene a special interest groups on books and their metadata at Crossref, and it would be a really good topic for conversation about what can we do to expose the preservation status of books and other media forms. How do we get the same spotlight shone on those as we've been able to with the journal ecosystem? So quite a speculative answer, but that's my guess on it, and that's what I'd like to do about it.
Great. Thank you. A question from Bridget. How do you balance the desire to have large swaths of material in multiple archives against the server space that requires in fiscal and environmental resources?
So I suppose one thing to say is, and this is a bit of a whataboutism, I guess, which I should be careful of, but compared to, say, the major AI players and the server resources they consume, The server resources to digitally preserve all the scholarly content in the world is not enormous. We're actually talking about a pretty niche. Sorry, Leah, your cat has just come into the shot and is very
It's
distracted.
my dog. Yes.
Oh, it's a dog. Sorry.
Yes.
Fantastic. Very amusing.
Sorry.
We were talking about dogs earlier. The total size of an archive that I can't condone, but that serves as a useful benchmark Sci-Hub is approximately 120 terabytes or so. That, compared to the things other tech giants are doing, is relatively insignificant. You know, I can run that kind of resource in my home using a few NAS boxes. Now, a digital preservation operation will have to be more sizable than my home setup, obviously. And most digital preservation structures work in triplicate anyway. So if you preserve with clocks, they have a triplicate set of theses where, you know, everything has to end up in 3 different storage locations and 3 different geolocated spaces around the world to give redundancy to what they do. So I guess when I said if you're in 3 archives, that's good, you're actually in 9 locations by that point. So perhaps I've gone for overkill on my scoring system. I don't know. You know, maybe silver is the more reasonable benchmark, and gives some compromise between the financial and economic, physical, material costs of preservation. On the other hand, when you look at this in the scale of what other parts of Silicon Valley tech industry are doing, we are not the ones who have destroyed the planet by trying to preserve scholarship on Shakespeare. So that's the kind of balancing act I think that we're playing with.
Thank you. Let's see. Question from Michelle. Could Crossref consider using NASIG model data preservation policy to help support members? And she provided a link that I'll drop in the chat. This is designed as a tool to help measure, grow, and publicize an organization's commitment to preserving its scholarship.
Absolutely. And there's also a standards panel recommendation coming out shortly, I believe, from NISO on digital preservation. The challenge is how we integrate this into the onboarding process. You know, what we don't want to do is to overload new members with so much information that they get freaked out, they wish they'd never applied to get DOIs, and just back away from the whole thing because they're frightened by the amount they have to do and the volume of information they have to ingest. At the same time, where there are recommendations and standards, those are really important to use as benchmarks to show people this isn't just us being fussy. There is actually a proper you know, set of recommendations you should be following here that are part of what we're doing. So absolutely. And we're going to work on our onboarding process to try to get members to look at standards documents like the ones which you gestured.
We had a comment in the chat earlier from Elena about the slides, that it was difficult to read the X and Y axis labels, and she asked if you would share the slides after the presentation. So if you'll be so kind as to email those, I'll be happy to put them up on the agenda so everyone can download and view those separately.
Absolutely. Also, just to say that the full graphs are available at the-vault.fly.dev, that URL I had. So that's in the slides. So when I share the slides, you can go and explore those digital interactive graphs as well, if you like.
Perfect. Another question. This is from Paul. Copyright law and treaties don't seem to be helpful because of the strength of owners' rights. Is there potential at the regulatory level to help with preservation?
It's very difficult to get anything done at the regulatory level with contemporary politics being what it is, I'm afraid to say. But this is absolutely true. So the project that I talked about, Project OpSit, that we're running, where we hope to be this sort of central funnel that can pass material on to digital preservation archives, we are only working with open access publishers in that space already under an open license, because otherwise every single thing that's deposited we would need to see a contract. We'd have to have an arrangement in place with the member to do it. And that's what organizations like Clocks, Locks and Portico and all the others are actually doing. I mean, the Internet Archive does it without asking anybody, and gets itself in trouble commensurately for doing so. But otherwise you fall into this copyright trap. I also worry that the backlash against the use of academic material for the training of AI material is going to worsen this. What it seems to have done is to strengthen authors' desire for strong intellectual property control over the material they produce. I want to stop my material being ingested by AI, whereas being ingested by AI and fueling new systems is probably one of the reuse cases that the open access movement was talking about when it said they wanted material available for reuse. So we've got differing sets of motivations for different strengths of IP protection here. It would be great if we could get some political regulatory intervention. I mean, digital deposit laws, we have a digital deposit law in the UK that technically any material published with an ISSN that is digitally available is supposed to be deposited legally at the British Library, for instance. Does everyone do that? No, they most certainly do not. It's also highly restricted, so access to see that material is only available on site. So you've got this ridiculous situation where material that was originally globally circulating on the internet in the digital deposit system can only be accessed by going to London and sitting in a terminal in the British Library, one person at a time accessing this. So that's the other problem, is that these regulatory interventions often tend to be quite restrictive because they're still thinking in print terms about what this stuff looks like and think about number of copies, the space you access it, the physicality of access. So I'd love to see it, but I'm not particularly hopeful that we'll get anything that's really helpful on that front.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions or comments at this time. Anybody else have a question in the chat or the Q&A? You can throw it up there. Otherwise, we're getting close to end time. Martin, would you like to say anything to conclude or wrap up?
I guess what I'd say is I've done a couple of versions of this talk to smaller audiences before, and what usually happens is a couple of people email me the day after and say, you're definitely missing this archive. What I would like to do is to hear from anybody who thinks they might be interested in putting together a more permanent version of what I've built, this infrastructure for preservation, this DOI-based structure of looking up whether something is preserved or not, because it seems to me a huge hole in our current infrastructure. And without the knowledge of what our landscape of preservation looks like, I just can't see how we can fix it.
All right. Well, thank you. Again, I don't see any more questions or comments, so I will take this opportunity to say thank you to Martin for being here to present live. It was a fascinating presentation, and thank all of you for being here and asking great questions. And I will see you around the rest of the week at the virtual Charleston conference. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.